What if it's not about a building? What if it's not about stained glass or steeples? What if it's about just Jesus?
All right, I'm going to break this up a little bit. We broke rule number 1 of this podcast. And I don't even know if you guys know what it is.
I didn't know we had rules.
Yeah, me either. This is the first to me.
Right. And, well, when we started this thing, and Corey, I even told you when you were preaching, don't mention things and not go in detail and assume people know what you're talking about.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I always love that.
And that's exactly what we did when we talked about the Gospels. We didn't go in any detail. We talked about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but we didn't say why they were the Gospels or go in any detail about it. And I think we need to dive into that and explain all of it, start to finish.
Let's go.
I like that because I'm deep in the Chosen right now. And we're getting to that point. So I'm kind of pumped. I haven't met Mark yet. So I don't know. We're not friends. I don't know what's happened yet.
You are friends with him. Actually, you've been friends with him for longer than you know, since you've been a Christian.
I guess so. Yeah. But I've not put a
You've
face.
just not met him on the show.
No, I've not put a face to the name yet. So I'm not really sure what his part plays. But I know Matthew and John.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I've met Luke yet.
Nope.
Mm-mm.
You haven't.
Okay.
And that's part of what we want to talk about here. So the first 4 books of the New Testament is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Mm-hmm.
That's the Gospels. And I want to hit some of the highlights of what I know. Matthew, Mark, and John, they were with Jesus. Did Luke ever even meet Jesus?
No, he came afterwards, and he dealt a lot with Paul. So,
That's right.
So Paul was coming in on the tail end, and he was actually a lot more of an advocate to Paul.
Is Paul Saul?
Yes.
Okay.
Before the transformation. And just for a note, that's not the Saul of the Old Testament who was the king of Israel.
And that's where I got confused with the whole Paul and Saul and the kings and who was a king, who wasn't.
Yeah, and a lot of times you will, because there are names from the past law or the Old Testament into the New Testament, and maybe somebody else was named that, and it does get kind of difficult.
All right. And Savannah, you're watching The Chosen. So you're watching these people develop their relationship with Jesus. You've met Matthew, Mark, and John as they kind of meet Jesus, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of what we're leading into. Those were apostles, but what happened to the other apostles? Why are they not part of the gospel per se?
I know. Like, I just met Thomas, which I met Thomas, and Thomas came back. And does Thomas have a gospel?
Actually, Thomas does have a gospel, but it's not in the Bible.
Oh, wow. We just got really deep on that one.
There's actually things in the Bible that was back when they were making up the Bible that for whatever the reason they decided to take out of the Bible. And Thomas had gospels. So,
and those are all probably, because there's places that you can go and find these scrolls and all these things. So those
Yes.
are all saved.
yes, and the thing is, you can find all those things. The issue is, and there's a big issue, because a lot of people have a real problem with that. And they think that, why were they taken out?
Well, here's my question. And this is kind of where I struggled. In the beginning, it's, okay, so essentially this is a book written by man.
Mm-hmm.
And what gave them the authority to decide what goes in and what doesn't?
Well, you see, all of that is like when God tells you something,
Mm-hmm.
which you do believe he does that.
Yes.
And nobody can make you doubt that, correct?
Right.
When you know it's him. God dealt with those men just the same, except some of those men he physically walked with. Jesus, his apostles who wrote the Gospels. And like, there are things today that when you switch from one revision of the Bible to another revision of the Bible, from like the first revision of what we have in the KJV, you can think about, like, I think the first one as it was transferred over into English language was like 1611, which some of the letters are not even the same.
Mhm.
You or me or Stephen or any of us could not take the 1611 Bible, which was translated over to English language, as the first translation
Mhm.
of our language, which, by the way, the person that translated the Bible from the Hebrew, from the original languages to English, was burned at the stake. Just for a note. Um, Imagine that. So then that Bible was 1611. Well, there was so many different things in the language, writing and literature, that we couldn't even read today. Like, the letters were literally different.
And that's where every translation, they say we lose a little bit or it's been
Mhm.
tweaked with and adjusted by man,
Yes.
right?
Yes. And so these different revisions, some of them will literally, these other men from King James and from the men that he pointed to translate the Greek and the Hebrew language over into our language so we could read it. Now, from KJV, you've got so many other revisions where they decide from the King James, basically, whether they're going to keep certain words or certain sentences in the verses. So you may read, like, NIV, you may read one sentence and compare it to like KJV, and it be like completely shorter by a paragraph because they felt that that wasn't needed.
Makes
And,
perfect sense to me. I mean,
but
and
my
that's what we do with everything, right?
but
Oh,
my
that's not needed. Let's condense it down to make it more readable
exactly.
and what I
Mhm.
want it to be.
The only thing is that makes for like a riot in the Christian community because people
Absolutely.
are just going crazy all the way around. And why didn't they keep this? Why didn't they keep Thomas's accounts? These other accounts? Why'd they get taken out? At the end of the day, we don't know. All we have to go by is what we have to go by. Now, you could go on a rampage and look all these things up and find them and study them all and preach about all of them. But in the end, they didn't get put in there. I'm not one of these people that think, oh, it's all man-made and men are crazy and they missed the mark. And so a lot of things should have been put in that didn't get put in. I don't think like that. I think God is a divine, all-powerful God, and if he wanted it in there, it'd be in there. So
I never thought about it that way. I mean, that the men writing this book, God definitely had a hand in it, guiding them and letting them put together what he felt needed to be in there.
yeah, and you can get in a very controversial subject of, well, at the end, they're only men and they make mistakes. But there's a difference in being a person that's just going out on a limb to maybe do something that you're inspired to do, as opposed to being divinely or godly inspired to do it, led by his Holy Spirit. And at that point, nobody has the authority to stand on a level to say, well, that's just a man, that could never be right. Listen, when God is in it, we don't, even God said in the Bible, he has a verse of scripture that said, who are you to judge my servant?
Mm.
Who are you to judge the one that I hold up? So that's why there's so many things that, yeah, you can question and you can look into and you can study it out. But in the end, if God wanted it to be in there and he wanted you to be stressed out all about it, then he would have had it in there, and he would, he never wants us to be stressed about anything out of our control like that. We didn't make the Bible. We didn't bring it together and decide all of these translations and how they would be put together. God did that with his spirit and with the chosen people that he put his spirit in and literally transferred information from heaven to earth to these people. And nobody in this earth has the authority to judge that.
Right. And I wanted to break down what gospel means. So I looked it up, and here it says in Mark 1:1, you can read that it says, "This is the good news about Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God." And then if you go over here to the actual definition, it's the news about who Jesus Christ is and what he has done, how that changes everything.
Yeah,
So that's what those 4 books are mainly about, right? Just the life of Jesus, what he did here.
exactly. Just the detail of the life of actually the man, the Son of God, Jesus the Messiah, being sent here, born into this earth in a lowly manger, um, growing up, to 30 years old, and then starting the ministry, doing miracles as the Son of God, and then being brutally beaten by the Roman Empire, leading up to the mountain called Golgotha, which means place of skulls, where they would lead him to an awful, shameful thief and murderer's path that he would take upon him. So the way that the lowest of the lowest people on this earth could not get no lower than where Jesus already went for every one of us. And he was also exalted when he was put to death on the cross. Then he was placed in the tomb and then resurrected after 3 days with all power in heaven and in earth. So much power that God the Father, who sent his Son, would say this, as he said on the mountain of transfiguration. And if you want to look that up, you can, all about it. But as God said then, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him now. Hear him." All arrows point to Jesus, the one who said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." And once he resurrected, he ascended back to the Father and is now sitting on the right hand of God. And he's the mediator between God and man. He is the only way to God, Jesus.
That's perfect. And if you look at the Gospels, and Svenny, you probably know this already, but if you don't, a lot of them have the same stories, the same miracles, the same stuff, because they walk together. That would be like us 3 walking with somebody, documenting the same thing. And you hear people talk all the time. Yeah, well, they had different things. They one story tells it this way, the other tells it another way.
Yeah.
But of course, we're going to document things at different times because they didn't walk around writing, right?
Mm-mm.
I mean, they wrote it after the fact.
Sure.
Yeah.
So of course it's going to be different.
That's where I'm at right now. John is getting the accounts of everybody. So what their stories are firsthand.
Right. And that's what we talked about prior to the podcast was how come Peter doesn't have it? How come the other apostles don't have what's considered a gospel? And Corey, you kind of hit it on the head. I was just reading through them, but they're not actually going through writing the account of Jesus, right?
Exactly. And all 12 apostles don't have books,
That's a good point too. Yeah.
And the reason is because Stephen, like, you're a follower of Christ, but there's lots of followers of Christ today who feel led and inspired to write a Christian book. Some feel led and inspired to do mission work and go out in distant lands and all across the world to share the gospel, to show people what the love of Jesus is supposed to look like, to feed the hungry and to house the homeless. And some people may do it right in their backyard, and they may start churches or they may start street ministries. all of these different things to win souls to the kingdom. And some of those apostles were called afterwards or more equipped to write, and some were not.
So I have a question as far as the apostles go. Was Mary considered an apostle? I know that times were so different and how women were recognized and treated just overall in general was
Yeah.
completely different.
No.
She was not, but
Mm-mm.
she was a
But
true follower of the faith.
exactly. Yes, of course she was. There was many women who did great things, like the sister of Lazarus, another Mary, who traveled in and around with Jesus and his apostles.
She was there from the beginning.
Of course, but there were only 12 apostles
So I haven't gotten that far
that
yet.
were
We
all
haven't gathered.
men.
Okay, so she
Yeah.
was just an extra.
They all were. There were several women, but they were all needful, and they were all, and many times they ministered to Jesus. The Bible says. And am I saying they preached the gospel to Jesus? No, I'm saying they met his needs, whatever. Like when we do anything to get the day of the church, like say on Sunday, we're trying to get things going. Whatever we all do, that's a way of ministering because it's meeting a need. We're serving, and overall, we're serving the body of Jesus. And it's just that different things and ways and outreaches for so many different people. Some people have biker ministries, you know. Some people say that God placed in the church as a whole from the 12 apostles. God set in the church first apostles, secondarily prophets, thirdly teachers, helps, healings, miracles, diversities of tongues. Some people would say that the 12 apostles, after that, there was no more apostles. There was only those 12. Some people would say, I'm an apostle. I preach, and I'm not talking about me. I'm talking about people in the world. They would call themselves an apostle, and they would say that those gifts and those things are still carrying on. Very controversial subjects because a lot of people think they know and don't know. A lot of people say this is right and it may not be right, and some people say, it's right and it may be right. But and like Peter, when we talked about, why is he not in the four gospels? Just talking about the life of Jesus or whatever had to do with the life of Jesus, because those times were the Jewish customs. Jesus was a Jew from the tribe of Judah. Jew is a short for Judah. It's starting from that point in Israel. That's where salvation started. That's where God started all of his different informative things, like the Ten Commandments, starting at Moses, or before that, Abraham on Mount Moriah, as he asked him to sacrifice his son. And that's where the greatest faith of all was established, and why Abraham was called the father of faith. But all of these things started from there. So first, Jesus wanted to go into the house of the Jewish people. Everything that was a Jew, it was touched and preached to, or that's what Jesus wanted. Then Jesus even spoke to some people in some gospels that the person would come to Jesus and say, I know you're the Messiah. I have a daughter that's vexed with the devil. I need you to touch her and heal her. There was a woman that came to Jesus at one point that was not a Jew or a Gentile. She was a crossbreed, and you call that a Samaritan, but still not a Jew. And at this time, very strategic time in Jesus' ministry, he said, I only want you going into the house of the Jewish faith, to the house of Israel. And he was talking just about the Jews. And literally, the woman came to him and said, I have a daughter that's grievously vexed with the devil. I need you to deliver her. And Jesus said, it's not meet to take the children's bread and cast it to dogs. He was literally saying, this is not what it's for. This is not what my miracles, my gifts are for. This healing, it's not for you. You're basically an animal and a beast, and I'm not giving this to you.
So he was going specifically to and for the Jews, but yet the Jews don't recognize him as the Messiah. Is this correct?
Exactly right. And they didn't
Well,
then.
That's what I'm. Yeah, I'm like that's
The
kind
Bible
of.
said Jesus came to his own, and his own did not recognize him.
That's a bummer.
That's the Pharisees are the Jews. Like, that's the leading religion of the Jewish customs from the very beginning. They loved God and would have done more than anybody for God.
Nicodemus believes him in the show.
But see how it turns out.
I don't know yet. Don't tell me.
But you know that Jesus was saying, follow me.
Yeah, and he didn't go. He left the money and he was heartbroken.
So did he believe? Because in the end, if
He
you
chose his
say,
family over Jesus.
it's just like the rich young ruler that said, what do I do? Well, as long as he was saying, love and show peace and keep the 10 commandments, he could do all that. Don't kill, don't steal, don't covet. As long as Jesus was saying those things to the person, it was all good. Yeah, I've kept this from my youth up. But then Jesus said, okay, but there's one more thing. Sell everything you have and give to the poor. It's like, to Nicodemus, for him to follow Jesus, that would have meant he would have had to have left all of his reputation, all of his clout in the Pharisees and the high standards, and he was one of the highest.
They've
That
made
would
it
have-
seem like so far it was because of his wife.
But
But
it's
a
him
show.
too,
Yeah.
and that is there was a one story in the Gospels where Jesus put out a parable, and he said, this man is making this great supper, and he's sending it out to everybody. But one person said, I have a wife, therefore I cannot come. I have a yoke of oxen, I cannot come. I have a piece of land that I need to prove, I cannot come. All of these things were different excuses. Even one man said, hey, Jesus, I definitely want to follow you, but my father just died. Please let me go to handle that affair. And then as soon as that happens, I'll follow you. And you know what Jesus said? Let the dead bury the dead, and you follow me now. So it's just like Jesus is a whole different kit and caboodle, like night and day from everything that the Jews had ever seen and had ever experienced, even from the highest of the Pharisees and the Sadducees and all the Jewish leaders. And he came to his own, and his own received him not. They didn't recognize him. They didn't even know he was the Son of God. I mean, for God's sake, he was a person that was born in a lowly place, and he was born in a feeding trough.
So speaking of him being born, there's two gospels that talk about him being born, Matthew and Luke, which is funny because Luke didn't actually talk to Jesus, right? And neither one of them saw it happen. They weren't there. So that makes me wonder how they can do it. Then you go back and you think of like Moses writing several of the first books of the Bible, Genesis being one of them. He wasn't there. Is that kind of the same?
Who wasn't there?
Moses.
It is exactly the same, because he had divine communication
And that's where I was going to
straight
ask.
from God.
What about this one? Did Matthew and Luke? He talked to Jesus.
Luke had Paul, which Paul, either way, God could have dealt directly with Luke, Jesus could have, or Paul could have given him the words. And a lot of times that happened.
Because Paul had a connection, a divine connection.
Luke,
right?
yes, Luke was Paul's, if you would, maybe protege. Like in a lot of the ways, Paul was a mentor to Luke. But Luke had a really clear understanding. He was a very intellectual man. He was a doctor. He was a physician. Many times in the Bible in the gospel compared Jesus to a physician. Jesus said in his own red letters, he that is whole needs not a physician, doesn't need a physician, but he that is sick needs a physician. Sick how? Could he be sick physically? Of course he could. But Jesus was talking about a spiritual sickness that we're all filled with before Jesus. Sin. Sin, Jesus said, I did not come here to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. And self-righteousness to think that you don't need Jesus, to think that you're good enough, you're a good enough person. If you're a great person and you give to charities and you do for the elderly and you're very polite and you seem like an upstanding man or woman in the community, you're good, you seem good. That does not save you and that does not bring you salvation. The only thing that makes you in right standing with God is Jesus Christ. And then until you call Jesus Christ into your life, then you are tainted or stained with sin. That's just the way it is. Like these things, a lot of these things can't even be explained, but a lot of times we need to know too that it ain't all about the facts as much as it is about faith. Faith is believing without seeing.
Yeah, you described it as the wind one day.
Yeah.
You can feel it.
So did Nicodemus.
Yeah. No, Jesus.
Well, Jesus did to Nicodemus. Yeah. John 3, I believe.
That was cool.
He said the wind blows where it wishes. You can hear the sound of it, but you can't tell.
You can feel it.
Yeah, you can feel it, but you can't tell where it's coming from or where it's going. And so also are all them that are born of the Spirit, born of God. You're carried and led and inspired by an invisible divinity or inspiration. That's what faith is. Like I was talking to a man the other day on media that was basically saying you can't prove Jesus is real. And the thing is that the key to it all is if you could imagine a person, just say you could imagine a person that had lost their father. Their father was dead, but he died in a later part of their life, so they got to spend all this time with him. But nevertheless, he was dead. But somehow in his tragedy, every piece of memorabilia that was kept, every picture, everything that showed some form that he was alive or that he lived was destroyed. However, it doesn't matter, but it was. And so anytime you ask that person about their father, they had nothing to show you. Nothing. You have nothing to show that they physically lived, but you know because you had a relationship with them, you know because you spent time with Him. You did. And maybe nobody else knows it, but you know it, and nobody can make you doubt it. Because in your heart, your Father's not dead. The same way with our Father. Doesn't matter if we had all of the facts in the world that we could just lay out on a table for you. Well, wouldn't that be easy? Then faith would be a lot easier, wouldn't it? I mean, we would have multitudes and multitudes following Jesus, but it's not that way. And frankly, it comes down to this, as Jesus told Thomas, blessed are you. You're blessed because you see and believe. But the real blessing is this, that you would believe without seeing. Be blessed.